The scent of another woman's perfume, cloying and foreign, choked Dallery the moment she pushed open the grand oak door of her family home. Before her suitcase even hit the polished floorboards, she saw them. Percival Thorne, her husband of 28 years, intimately entwined with Seraphina Finch, his secretary beneath the twinkling lights of their Christmas tree. A searing pain shot through her, a cold fist clenching her gut, stealing her breath. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the sheer breathtaking audacity of it played out in the sacred heart of their home. But even as her world shattered, Dallery's mind, honed by years of quiet observation, registered a faint flicker of the hidden leverage, the tiny, almost imperceptible red light on the digital voice recorder concealed within the deep pocket of her tailored coat, a habit she'd developed after too many misunderstandings at Percival's firm over the years. She stood frozen in the arched doorway, still wearing the practical travel clothes from her visit with her sister Vivian in Phoenix. The man she had loved since she was a vibrant 26 now unwrapped Seraphina, as if the younger woman was his personal gift from Santa, not a symptom of his wretched midlife crisis. She had texted Percival that her flight had been delayed, giving him a full extra day. Apparently that was all the invitation he needed to turn their elegant drawing room into a cheap love nest. The magnificent fur which they had decorated together just 2 weeks prior now looked like a stage prop for their tawdry romantic comedy. The lights Dallery had spent hours untangling twinkled down on them as Percival murmured sweet nothings into Seraphina's ear, the same ear that usually heard Dallery's dictated reports for the accounting firm where Seraphina worked as his assistant. Well, clearly she was taking dictation of a very different kind now, Percival Dallery said. And her voice against all odds sounded surprisingly steady, considering her entire world had just imploded. They sprang apart, like startled children caught in a forbidden act. Seraphina's face went 3 shades of crimson, perfectly matching the velvet ribbons on the Christmas tree. She began to babble something incoherent about working late and reviewing urgent year-end files as if Dallery were blind as well as stupid. Percival at least had the decency to look deeply ashamed, though he was already attempting to arrange his features into what Dallery recognized as his "let me explain" expression. "Dallery, I can explain?" He began right on cue. "I'm sure you can." Dallery said, her movements precise, as she set her leather purse down on the small, antique console table. "But I don't think I need to hear about your filing system right now." Seraphina, bless her, didn't linger. She grabbed her coat from the back of an armchair and mumbled something about forgetting an important appointment, practically sprinting for the door. Smart girl. If she had stuck around, Dallery might have explained exactly what she thought of her Christmas spirit, or rather lack thereof. Percival ran a hand through his immaculately coiffed silver hair, a nervous habit Dallery had once found endearing for nearly 3 decades. Not so much anymore. "Dallery, please sit down. Let's talk about this like adults." "Adults." Dallery repeated, her gaze sweeping over the elaborate Christmas tree that had apparently been hosting more than just presents. "Is that what we're calling it? It's not what you think." "I think it's exactly what I think, Percival. Unless you were performing CPR on Seraphina under our Christmas tree, and she needed mouth-to-mouth for an unusually long time." He actually had the nerve to look annoyed. "Don't be sarcastic, Dallery. This is serious." Sarcastic, Dallery laughed, and the sound was hollow even to her own ears. "Percival, I just walked into my own home and found my husband of 28 years playing Santa Claus with his secretary. Sarcasm is pretty much all I've got left right now." Dallery whites. How long Dallery cut him off, her voice sharp. She didn't really want to know, but she needed to. 6 months, he said quietly, his gaze dropping to the Persian rug. 6 months. While Dallery had been working extra hours at the city library to help pay for his mother's care home. While she had been planning their anniversary trip to the Italian Dolomites for next spring. While she had been buying thoughtful Christmas gifts for his entire family, including a nice bonus gift card for Serafina, because Percival had specifically said Serafina had been such a helpful employee this year. Helpful indeed. "I want you to leave, Dallery," said her voice now flat and cold. "Dallery, this is my house too. We need to— I want you to leave right now, Percival. Take whatever you need for tonight. We can figure out the rest later. But I can't look at you right now without wanting to redecorate this room with whatever's closest to my hands." He must have seen something in her expression that convinced him she wasn't bluffing, because he nodded slowly and headed upstairs. Dallery heard him moving around, opening drawers, running water. Normal sounds that now felt utterly foreign, utterly tainted. 20 minutes later, he came back downstairs with a small leather suitcase and his sheepish expression back in place. "Dallery, I know this is horrible, but maybe it's a blessing in disguise. We haven't been happy for a while. You know that." Dallery stared at him, a fresh wave of disbelief washing over her. "Percival, up until 20 minutes ago, I thought we were fine. I thought we were planning to travel next year when you retire. I thought we were in this together. We just grew apart," he said, like it was something that had happened to them, a natural disaster, instead of something he had chosen. "No, Percival," Dallery retorted, a new edge entering her voice. "I didn't grow apart. You grew into Serafina." He actually winced at that. Good, he should. "I'll call you tomorrow. We need to talk about how to handle this practically. The house, the finances, all of it." Dallery nodded mainly because she wanted him out of her sight. Before she said something she couldn't take back, or through something she couldn't take back. After he left, she stood in her opulent drawing room looking at their Christmas tree. 28 years of Christmas mornings, and this was how it ended. With the cloying smell of another woman's perfume still hanging in the air, and the Christmas lights twinkling over the very spot where her marriage had died. Dallery walked over and unplugged the tree. Then she grabbed her coat and walked out into the crisp December night, leaving everything behind. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she couldn't stay in that house with the ghost of their illicit romance haunting her Christmas tree. That's when she realized her real Christmas story was just beginning. The cold air hit Dallari's face like a potent wake-up call, which was exactly what she needed. She'd been walking for about 20 minutes, letting her feet choose the direction, while her mind tried to process the surreal events of the past hour. The affluent neighborhood, usually so comforting in its familiar grandeur, looked different at night. All the meticulously decorated Christmas displays transformed into little monuments to happy families she was no longer part of. She found herself downtown without really planning it, walking past the boutique shops that were all closed except for the Gilded Spoon Diner, which stayed open late for the dwindling Christmas shopping crowd. The streets were mostly empty, save for a few people hurrying to their cars, arms laden with shopping bags. Everyone seemed to have somewhere warm to go, someone waiting for them. That's when Dallery saw her. An elderly woman, fragile and elegant, stood near the steps of St. Jude's Cathedral, wearing a thin cashmere sweater that was no match for the biting December wind. She was looking around with the confused expression of someone who couldn't quite remember where she was supposed to be. No coat, no hat, and she was visibly shivering. Dallery's own problems for a moment suddenly felt smaller. At least she had somewhere warm to go eventually. "Excuse me," Dallery said, approaching the woman carefully, her voice gentle. "Are you all right?" The woman turned to her, and Dallery could see she was probably in her late 70s, with beautiful silver hair that was perfectly styled despite the wind's assault. She had the kind of refined bone structure that suggested she'd been stunning in her youth, but right now she just looked utterly lost and terribly cold. "I'm not sure," the woman said, her voice cultured with just a hint of an aristocratic accent Dallery couldn't quite place. "I was supposed to meet someone, but I can't quite remember who or when." She looked down at herself as if surprised by her own attire. And I seem to have forgotten my coat. It's freezing out here. Dallery observed her concern deepening. How long have you been waiting? I don't know, the woman confessed, and Dallery heard the distress creeping into her voice. I remember being in a warm car and then nothing until now. Dallery glanced around. There were no other people nearby, no idling car, just this elegant, elderly woman standing alone in the brutal cold, clearly confused, and possibly in the early stages of hypothermia. What's your name? Dallery asked gently. Elara, she said immediately, then frowned. Elara Hawthorne. Yes, that's right. Elara Hawthorne. Well, Elara, I'm Dallery, and I think we need to get you somewhere warm while we figure this out. There's a diner right across the street. Would you like to get some coffee? Elara looked at her with a profound relief that made Dallery's heart clench. That would be wonderful, but I don't think I have my purse. My treat, Dallery said, and meant it. Whatever was happening in her own life could wait. This woman needed help, and helping her felt like the first right thing she'd done all day. Dallery guided her across the street, keeping her arm linked through Elara's. Elara moved carefully but steadily, and Dallery noticed her shoes were expensive. The kind of exquisite leather flats that cost more than most people's monthly grocery bill. Her sweater, despite being too thin for the weather, was undeniably cashmere of the highest quality. Someone with money and presumably concern was missing this woman. The Gilded Spoon Diner was warm and brightly lit, decorated with tinsel and plastic holly that had probably been there since the Ford administration. The waitress, a tired-looking woman in her 40s with kind eyes, glanced up as they entered. 2 coffees, Dallery said, guiding Elara to a booth near the heater. And could we get some menus? Elara slid into the booth, gratefully wrapping her hands around the steaming coffee mug when it arrived. You're very kind, she said, her confusion seeming to lift a little in the warmth. I don't know what I was doing out there. Do you remember how you got to the cathedral? Did someone drive you? Elara closed her eyes, concentrating hard. There was a car. A nice car. But I don't remember getting out. She opened her eyes. Frustration clear on her face. This is so embarrassing. I pride myself on being sharp. Everyone gets confused sometimes, Dallery said, offering a reassuring smile. Though privately, she was wondering if Elara had early-stage dementia or if something else entirely had happened. Do you live around here? I think so. Or maybe not. Everything looks familiar and strange at the same time. Dallery pulled out her phone. Elara is there, someone I could call for you, family. Her face brightened. Yes, my son, Alistair. I have his number. She patted her sweater pockets, looking distressed again. But I don't have my phone. Do you remember his number? Elara rattled off a number with surprising confidence, the first thing she'd been certain about since Dallery had found her. Dallery dialed and put the phone on speaker so Elara could hear. It rang 3 times before a man's voice answered sharp with concern. Who is this? How did you get this number? My name is Dallery Thompson. Dallery said quickly, trying to sound calm and professional. I found a woman named Elara Hawthorne downtown. She says she's your mother. My God. Where is she? The relief in his voice was immediate and overwhelming. Is she hurt? I've been looking for her for 2 hours. She walked away from the car when we stopped for petrol, and when I came back from paying, she was gone. She's fine, just cold and a little confused. We're at the Gilded Spoon Diner on Main Street. I'll be there in 10 minutes, he said, his voice laced with urgency. Please don't let her leave. Thank you. Thank you so much for calling. Elara was listening, a proud smile spreading across her face. That's my Alistair, she said softly. He always sounds worried, but he's a good boy. Something about the way she said boy made Dalari smile despite everything. This was clearly a woman who would always see her children as children, no matter how old they got. He's on his way, Dalari told her. Should be here in about 10 minutes. Wonderful, Ilara said. Then looked at Dalari more closely. Dalari, you've been crying. Dalari touched her face, surprised. She hadn't realized. It's been a difficult evening. Would you like to talk about it? Ilara asked, her confusion seeming to clear as she focused on someone else's problems. I'm a good listener when I'm myself. Dalari found herself actually considering it, which was insane. She had just met this woman, and Ilara was clearly dealing with her own issues, but there was something about her presence that felt safe, comforting. My husband is having an affair, Dalari said before she could stop herself. I found them together tonight in our living room under our Christmas tree. Ilara reached across the table and patted Dalari's hand with surprising strength. Oh, my dear, that's terrible. What a fool he must be. It was such a simple, straightforward response that Dalari almost laughed. After 2 hours of confusion and shock, having someone just call Percival a fool felt surprisingly refreshing. 28 years? Dalari said, her voice barely a whisper. I thought we were happy. Men are mysterious creatures, Ilara said, with the authority of someone who had lived long enough to figure a few things out. They can be wonderful, and then they can be complete idiots sometimes in the very same day. His secretary, Dalari added, because somehow it felt important to share the full humiliation. Ilara tisked disapprovingly. How unoriginal of him. You'd think after 28 years he'd at least be creative in his stupidity. That did make Dalari laugh. A real, genuine laugh that surprised her. You know what? You're absolutely right. If he was going to blow up our marriage, he could have at least done it with some style. They were both still chuckling softly when the diner door opened, and a man rushed in, scanning the room until his sharp eyes landed on their booth. He was tall, probably in his early 50s, with distinguished silvering hair at the temples, and the kind of commanding bearing that suggested he was used to being in charge. He looked like Ilara, with the same elegant cheekbones and aristocratic nose. He also looked like he'd been through his own kind of hell for the past 2 hours. Mother, he said, reaching their table in 3 quick strides. That's when everything got very interesting. The man who rushed to their table was not what Dalari had expected. She'd pictured Ilara's son as someone elderly himself, maybe a tired 60-something, dealing with the inevitable burdens of an aging parent. Instead, Alistair Hawthorne looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine feature about successful businessmen, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing an expensive wool coat that probably cost more than Dalari's car payment. He had Ilara's same vivid blue eyes, but where hers were currently warm and confused, his were sharp with worry, and something that looked like barely controlled frustration. Mother, he said again, sliding into the booth next to Ilara, and immediately pulling her into a fierce hug that made Dalari's chest tighten. The relief on his face was so raw it almost hurt to watch. Thank God you're safe. Alistair, darling, Ilara said, patting his cheek like he was still 5 years old. I'm fine. This lovely woman took care of me. She turned to Dalari, a proud light in her eyes. Dalari? This is my son, Alistair. Alistair turned to Dalari, and she got the full force of his intense attention. It was like being evaluated by a very expensive barrister who was trying to decide if she was worth his time. Dalari Thompson, she said, extending her hand. I found your mother outside St. Jude's Cathedral. She was cold and seemed confused. He shook her hand, and Dalari noticed his was trembling slightly beneath its outwardly firm grip. I can't thank you enough. When I came back from the petrol station and she was gone. He ran his free hand through his hair, a mirror of Percival's earlier nervous habit, though somehow on Alistair it seemed more genuine, less calculated. She was there 1 second, and then just vanished. I wandered off. Ilara said cheerfully as if discussing the weather. I do that sometimes lately, but Dallery rescued me and brought me somewhere warm. Alistair's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Mother, you know you're supposed to stay in the car when I'm paying for petrol. Do I? Ilara asked, genuine confusion returning to her voice. I thought you said I could stretch my legs. Dallery watched this exchange with growing understanding. Ilara wasn't just having a bad night. This was something ongoing. Alistair's careful patience suggested he'd been dealing with this for a while. It's getting worse, isn't it? Dallery asked quietly, her gaze meeting Alistair's. For a second, his professional composure slipped. Early-stage Alzheimer's. She was diagnosed 6 months ago. His voice was carefully controlled now, laced with a barely concealed weariness. Most days she's completely herself, but when she gets tired or stressed, I'm sitting right here, Ilara said with dignity, though a faint tremor ran through her voice. And I can hear you discussing me. You're right, Mother. I apologize. Alistair's tone immediately shifted to something warmer, softer. Are you ready to go home? Not yet, Ilara said, turning to Dallery with sudden intensity. Dallery was telling me about her husband, the fool who's having an affair with his secretary. Alistair's eyebrows shot up, and he looked at Dallery with an expression that was part surprise and part something Dallery couldn't quite identify. I'm sorry, that's difficult, he said carefully. It's been an interesting evening, Dallery replied, suddenly self-conscious. Here she was sharing her personal disasters with strangers in a brightly lit diner. I probably shouldn't have burdened your mother with my problems. Nonsense, Ilara said firmly. Problems shared are problems halved. That's what my Sterling used to say. She turned to Alistair. Sterling used to say that, didn't he? Yes, Mother. Father always said that. The way he said father made it clear Sterling was no longer around. Ilara had lost her husband, was losing her memories, and now her son was clearly carrying the weight of caring for her alone. Suddenly, Dallery's own marital problems felt momentarily smaller in comparison. Well, Dallery said, starting to stand, I should let you two get home. It's late, and I'm sure you've had enough excitement for one evening. Wait, Alistair said, and there was something urgent in his voice. Please, sit for a minute. I want to... He paused, seeming to struggle with something, then continued. I want to properly thank you. What you did tonight. Helping my mother, calling me. Most people would have just minded their own business. Anyone would have done the same thing, Dallery said, but she sat back down. No, he said firmly. They wouldn't have. I know, because this isn't the first time she's wandered off, and you're the first person who's actually helped her, instead of just calling the authorities. Ilara was listening to this exchange with interest, her confusion seeming to come and go like a radio station, fading in and out. Where do you live? Alistair asked. I'd like to drive you home. It's the least I can do. Dallery hesitated. She didn't particularly want to go back to her house, where Percival's betrayal was still hanging in the air like acrid smoke. But she also wasn't sure she wanted to get into a car with a stranger, even one who seemed genuinely grateful and undeniably attractive. Actually, Dallery said, I think I'll walk. I need the air. In this weather, it's freezing. I like the cold, Dallery lied, forcing a faint smile. Clears my head. Ilara was studying her with an expression that suggested her confusion had lifted again. Dallery, dear, you don't want to go home, do you? Her directness caught Dallery off guard. No, not particularly. Because of the fool husband, Mother Alistair said. But he was looking at Dallery with something that might have been understanding. Because of the fool husband, Dallery confirmed, a small, wry smile gracing her lips. Ilara nodded decisively. Then you'll come home with us. Mother, that's not... Alistair started, clearly exasperated. Nonsense, Ilara said, waving him off with a dismissive hand. We have 12 bedrooms in that ridiculous house you insisted on buying. Dallery needs somewhere to go tonight and we owe her a debt. It's settled. Alistair looked like he wanted to argue, but he also looked like he'd learned to pick his battles with his formidable mother. He turned to Dallery with an expression that was carefully polite, but clearly reluctant. "You're welcome to stay the night," he said, and Dallery could hear the effort it took to make the invitation sound sincere, though I'm sure you'd prefer to go to your own home. There was something in his tone that suggested he'd really prefer if Dal did prefer her own home, which perversely made her want to accept Ilara's invitation just to see what would happen. "That's very kind," Dallery said, a slight smile playing on her lips, "but I couldn't possibly impose." "It's not an imposition," Ilara declared firmly, her eyes sparkling with renewed clarity. "It's Christmas kindness. My Sterling always said Christmas was about helping people who need help." Ilara was right about one thing. Dallery did need help. She needed somewhere to go that wasn't her house with its lingering perfume and unplugged Christmas tree. She needed a night to think about what came next without having to stare at the very spot where her marriage had died. And honestly, she was curious about these people. Ilara with her fleeting confusion and unexpected warmth. Alistair with his careful control and obvious reluctance to have a stranger in his magnificent home. There was clearly more to their story than a simple case of early Alzheimer's. "All right," Dallery said, surprising even herself. "Just for tonight, thank you." Alistair's expression suggested he thought Dallery had just made a terrible mistake, but Ilara beamed, like Dallery had just given her the best Christmas present ever. "Wonderful," she exclaimed, clapping her hands together with childlike enthusiasm. "Alistair, call ahead and have Mrs. Morrison prepare the blue guest room. Dallery will need fresh towels and perhaps some of my nightgowns. We look about the same size." Alistair pulled out his phone with the air of someone who was used to managing his mother's unpredictable impulses. "Mrs. Morrison. We'll be home in about 20 minutes with a guest." Yes, the blue room would be fine. No, nothing urgent, just someone who helped Mother tonight. Dallery listened to him making arrangements with someone who was clearly household staff, and began to wonder exactly what she'd gotten herself into. The expensive coat, the casual mention of 12 bedrooms, the live-in help. The Hawthorns weren't just comfortable, they were wealthy, seriously wealthy. As they left the diner, Alistair helped Ilara into the passenger seat of what Dallery now saw was a sleek Mercedes S-Class sedan that probably cost more than Dallery made in 2 years. He opened the back door for her with careful politeness, his hand hovering near her elbow for a moment. "Thank you," Dallery said, as he climbed into the driver's seat. "No, thank you," Alistair said, meeting her eyes in the rearview mirror. "For helping her. For bringing her inside and keeping her safe." There was something in his voice that suggested this was more than mere politeness, something deeper, more raw. Whatever was happening with Ilara's condition, Alistair was clearly living with a level of constant worry. Dallery was only just beginning to understand. It struck a chord with Dallery's own lifetime of quiet responsibility, the steady hand she'd always been for Percival and her family, managing the small details and larger crises alike. She thought of her years at the library, the quiet satisfaction of bringing order to chaos, whether it was cataloguing ancient texts or simply organising the local book club. She wondered if Alistair felt the same quiet burden, the solitary nature of being the one who always held things together. As they drove through the city, Ilara kept up a steady stream of conversation, pointing out buildings and telling fragmented stories about the old days that seemed to span several different decades and sometimes contradicted each other. Alistair responded patiently, interjecting gentle corrections or questions. But Dallery caught him glancing at his mother, with an expression that was part deep love, part utter exhaustion, and part something that looked achingly like grief. It made Dallery think of her own relationship with her mother now gone, and how she sometimes wished she'd listened more closely to the stories, the non-linear narratives of a life lived. Perhaps she realized this was a glimpse into her own future, dealing with her own fading memories, or worse, dealing with the slow, agonizing fade of someone she loved. After about 15 minutes, they turned into a neighborhood Dallery had driven through many times but never actually entered. The houses grew progressively larger and farther apart, hidden behind imposing wrought-iron gates and impeccably maintained established landscaping. When Alistair turned into a long, winding driveway, marked by massive stone pillars, Dallery realized she'd made a significant miscalculation about exactly who these people were. The house at the end of the drive wasn't just large. It was a veritable mansion. 3 stories of fieldstone and timber, with enough windows to light a small town and a circular drive that could easily accommodate a dozen cars. It wasn't a home. It was an estate radiating an old money gravitas she hadn't encountered outside of a historical fiction novel. "Welcome to Hawthorne House," Ilara said proudly, gesturing grandly with one hand. "My Sterling built it for me when Alistair was born. I thought it was ridiculously large then, and I still think it's ridiculously large now." Alistair pulled up in front of a heavy, carved oak entrance that belonged on the cover of an architectural magazine. "Mother has always preferred smaller spaces," he said dryly, a wry smile touching his lips. "But she refuses to move." "Where would I go?" Ilara asked reasonably, looking genuinely puzzled. "This is where I raised my children, where Sterling and I hosted countless parties where all my memories live." "You can't just pack up memories, Alistair." Dallery sat in the back seat, gazing up at this house that belonged to people who lived in a completely different world than hers, and wondered what the hell she was doing here. A few hours ago, she'd been a middle-class librarian dealing with a cheating husband. Now she was about to spend the night in a mansion with people who probably had more money than her entire hometown combined. Percival, with his careful accounting and his comfortable but predictable life, wouldn't even know how to navigate a world like this. She thought a faint, bitter amusement rising within her. He was ambitious, yes, but only within the confines of what he understood: safe investments, established firms, predictable returns. This level of opulence, this effortless old wealth, would have intimidated him just as it was frankly intimidating Dallery now. But then she had never been a slave to social niceties or inherited fortunes. Her worth, she had always believed, was in her mind, her diligence, her quiet integrity. That's when Dallery realized this might have been exactly what she needed. A night in someone else's world, where her problems couldn't follow her, where everything was too strange to feel real, too grand to feel immediate. Perhaps here she could find a temporary reprieve from the gut-wrenching pain of betrayal, a pause in the relentless self-recrimination that whispered, "How could you not have known? How could you have been so blind?" But as they walked up the broad stone steps to a front door that probably cost more than her Honda Civic, Dallery couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to discover there was much more to the Hawthorne family story than a wealthy son caring for his mother with dementia. She remembered the hidden recorder in her coat pocket, the small red light. Leverage. She thought a cold, hard word. Not just for Percival, but perhaps for herself in the grand, unpredictable drama that her life had suddenly become. Mrs. Morrison turned out to be a small, efficient woman in her 60s, with sharp, kind eyes and neat silver hair pulled back into a severe bun. She managed to convey both warmth and subtle authority in the time it took to hang up Dallery's coat in the cavernous foyer. She greeted Ilara with the kind of gentle familiarity that comes from years of loyal service, a deep, unspoken bond, and treated Dallery with a polite curiosity that suggested unexpected houseguests weren't entirely unusual, merely noteworthy. "I've prepared the blue guest room. Mr. Alistair," she told him, her voice soft, yet firm. "Fresh linens, extra towels, and I've put some of Mrs. Hawthorne's nightgowns and a robe in the closet." "Thank you, Mrs. Morrison," Alistair said, and Dallery caught the subtle relief in his voice. Clearly, having someone competent and trustworthy manage the household details was crucial. When your mother might wander off at any moment, or as Dallery was beginning to suspect, when her mother might choose to wander off with a very specific purpose. "I thought Dallery might like some tea," Ilara announced suddenly, as if she had just had a brilliant original idea, her eyes twinkling mischievously. "Mrs. Morrison, could you prepare that lovely chamomile blend? The one Sterling always said tasted like Christmas." Mrs. Morrison's expression softened, a rare, fond smile touching her lips. "Of course, Mrs. Hawthorne. I'll bring it to the sitting room directly." As Ilara, with a surprising burst of energy, headed toward what Dallery assumed was the sitting room, Alistair caught Dallery's arm gently, his touch firm but deferential. "I should explain," he said quietly, his voice low enough that even Mrs. Morrison, retreating towards the kitchen, wouldn't overhear. "About the house, about my mother's condition. You're probably wondering what you've gotten yourself into." The thought had crossed my mind. Dallery admitted a hint of dry humor in her tone. "Mother has good days and bad days. Tonight was actually better than some. Probably because helping you gave her something to focus on. But sometimes she doesn't recognize familiar places or people. Sometimes she thinks my father is still alive." He paused, his gaze searching Dallery's face. "I just wanted you to know in case she gets confused during the night," Dallery finished for him, understanding dawning. "Exactly. Mrs. Morrison sleeps in the room next to Mother's. But if you hear wandering or voices, don't be alarmed. It's normal." There was something heartbreaking about the way he said normal, as if he'd had to redefine that word to accommodate losing his mother piece by painful piece. It made Dallery consider the quiet, insidious cruelty of such a disease far worse than any sharp, sudden betrayal. A slow erosion of self, of memory, of connection. It was a kind of death that offered no swift closure, Alistair Dallery said. Then hesitated. It wasn't her business, not really, but something in his careful control. His quiet weariness reminded her of herself. Always managing, always responsible, always holding things together for others. "When was the last time you took a break?" He looked genuinely surprised by the question. "A break from what? Time away? Time when you weren't managing her care or worrying about her safety?" He paused, and Dallery could see him actually thinking about it, sifting through years of responsibilities. I can't remember. There's too much to manage. Medical appointments, safety concerns, legal issues, while she's still competent enough to make decisions about her estate. And I travel for work, which means coordinating with Mrs. Morrison and the day nurses. "You have day nurses?" Dallery asked, surprised. "3 different ones, rotating shifts when I'm not here. Mother hates it, but she can't be alone anymore." He ran his hand through his hair again, a gesture Dallery was starting to recognize as a deeply ingrained stress response. She was always so independent. This is killing her, losing herself piece by piece. They were interrupted by Ilara's clear, carrying voice, calling from the sitting room. "Dallery, come see Sterling's portrait." Alistair and Dallery exchanged glances. "She wants to show you my father," he explained, a faint, melancholic smile playing on his lips. "He died 3 years ago, but sometimes she talks about him like he just stepped out of the room." The sitting room was exactly what you'd expect in a house of this caliber: high ceilings, built-in bookshelves, filled with leather-bound volumes, furniture that probably cost more than most people's cars, all tastefully arranged. But it also felt lived-in, comfortable, undeniably a home. There were family photos everywhere. Books stacked on tables, as if recently read, a cashmere throw blanket, draped casually over one of the armchairs. Like someone actually used this room for quiet contemplation, not just formal entertaining. Ilara was standing in front of a large oil portrait, hanging majestically over the ornate marble fireplace. The man in the painting looked like an older, slightly softer version of Alistair. The same strong jaw, the same intelligent blue eyes, but warmer somehow, with a benevolent twinkle. He was smiling as if he'd just heard something amusing, or was about to deliver a particularly witty remark. "That's my Sterling," Alara said proudly, her arm sweeping towards the portrait. "Wasn't he handsome? Alistair looks just like him, you know. Same stubborn chin." "He was very handsome," Dallery agreed, and meant it. There was a quiet strength in the painted eyes, a dignity. "Sterling built this house for me when I was pregnant with Alistair." Alara continued, settling into a deep armchair near the crackling fireplace. "I told him it was too big, too fancy, but he said he wanted to give me a house where I could raise our children and grandchildren. He was always planning ahead." My Sterling. Alistair sat across from his mother in a matching armchair, and Dallery noticed how carefully he watched her, as if monitoring for the subtle signs of confusion. "Grandchildren?" Dallery asked, settling into a plush velvet chair that probably cost more than her monthly salary. Alara's face lit up. "Oh yes, Alistair's going to give me grandchildren someday. Aren't you, darling?" Alistair's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Mother, we've discussed this. Have we? I don't remember." Alara turned to Dallery conspiratorially. "He's 52 years old and still not married. Can you believe that a handsome, successful man like Alistair, and he spends all his time taking care of his old mother instead of finding a wife?" Mother Alistair said, a clear warning in his voice, but it was gentle, not harsh. "It's true," Alara said, completely unperturbed. "I tell him all the time. Sterling and I were married when we were 23. By the time Sterling was Alistair's age, Alistair was already in university. Mrs. Morrison appeared then with a silver tea service that looked like it belonged in a museum. As she gracefully served the fragrant chamomile tea in delicate porcelain cups, Dallery caught her exchanging a quick, knowing look with Alistair that suggested this was a familiar and frequently rehearsed conversation. Dallery, Alara said, accepting her teacup with a graceful nod. "You're about Alistair's age, aren't you? And you're getting divorced, so you'll be single soon. How convenient." Dallery nearly choked on her tea, her cheeks flushing warm. "Mrs. Hawthorne, I'm not actually divorced yet. As of this evening, I'm just separated by about 3 hours." "Even better?" Alara said decisively, completely unfazed. "Fresh start for both of you." Alistair looked like he wanted to sink through the floorboards. "Mother, please!" What, Alara asked innocently. "I'm just saying it's nice to see Alistair talking to a woman his own age for once. Usually it's just nurses and doctors, and that horrible Mrs. Pinter from the country club who keeps calling here." "Mrs. Pinter calls?" Dallery asked, genuinely curious. Alistair's discomfort was becoming rather entertaining, and frankly, after the evening, she'd had a little entertainment felt good. It was a welcome distraction from the searing ache in her own heart. "Every week," Alara said, with obvious distaste, stirring her tea with a tiny silver spoon. "She brings casseroles and asks about Alistair's availability. She's 68 years old and has been chasing eligible widowers since her husband died 5 years ago. Very persistent," Mother Alistair said firmly, drawing Alara's attention back. "I think our guest might prefer to rest rather than hear about Mrs. Pinter's romantic pursuits." "Actually," Dallery said, surprising herself after the day I've had hearing about someone else's dating disasters, "is exactly what I need." Alara beamed. "See, Dallery understands. Now tell me more about this husband of yours. What kind of man has an affair with his secretary? It's so unimaginative. And somehow, sitting in a mansion that belonged in a magazine, drinking tea that probably cost more per cup than she usually spent on a week's groceries." Dallery found herself telling the complete, unvarnished story to a woman with Alzheimer's, and her obviously uncomfortable yet intently listening son. She recounted the smell of the perfume, the sight of Percival and Seraphina beneath the twinkling lights, The cold pronouncements, the swift, brutal end of 28 years. She omitted the detail about the recorder that was her secret weapon, not for sharing. "So there I was," Dallery said, reaching the end of her tale, her voice growing stronger as she spoke the words aloud, releasing their power. "Standing in my own living room, watching my husband unwrap his secretary like she was his personal Christmas present." Ilara tisked disapprovingly. "Under your Christmas tree? How tacky." "Extremely tacky," Dallery agreed, a ghost of a bitter smile on her lips. "What did you say to him?" Ilara pressed, leaning forward eagerly. "I asked if he was performing CPR that required unusually long mouth-to-mouth resuscitation." Ilara burst into delighted laughter, a clear, unrestrained peal that filled the elegant room. Even Alistair cracked a genuine smile despite himself. "Perfect," Ilara declared, wiping a tear of mirth from the corner of her eye. "Sharp and dignified. That's exactly what I would have said." "What would you have said, Alistair?" Dallery looked at Alistair, because something about his reaction suggested this conversation was hitting close to home for him too. He'd seemed particularly uncomfortable with the topic of betrayal. "I would have said that people who betray trust usually do it because they're too cowardly to have honest conversations about what they really want," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames in the fireplace. There was something in his tone that made Dallery think he wasn't just talking about her situation. He was speaking from deeply personal experience. Ilara studied her son's face with the kind of piercing clarity that seemed to come and go unpredictably. "Alistair knows about betrayal," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't you, darling?" Alistair's expression shuttered immediately, his composure returning with a stark efficiency. "Mother." "That's not relevant and hardly appropriate dinner conversation, isn't it?" Ilara countered, ignoring him. "Dallery, did I tell you Alistair was engaged once?" "Mother, please don't." "A lovely girl named Clarissa." "Or was it Cora?" "One of those C names." "They were together for 3 years, and then she decided she preferred Alistair's business partner, took half their joint assets, and moved to California." Dallery looked at Alistair, who was staring into his teacup as if it contained the secrets of the universe, or at least a powerful sedative. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice gentle. "That must have been difficult." "Ancient history," he said, but his voice suggested it wasn't as ancient as he'd like it to be. The pain, though dulled by time, was still clearly present, a faint scar on his carefully constructed demeanour. 5 years isn't ancient," Ilara said helpfully. "And Alistair hasn't dated anyone seriously since. I think he's gun-shy." "Mother, I think our guest might be tired." Alistair's voice was strained, a desperate plea for a change of subject. Dallery was tired, utterly exhausted to her bones, but she was also fascinated by this sudden, unguarded glimpse into Alistair Hawthorne's carefully controlled life. The successful businessman facade was cracking, revealing someone who'd been deeply hurt and was still carrying the damage much like herself. It made him feel more human, more accessible, less the intimidating stranger from a different world. "Actually," Ilara said, standing up with a sudden, unexpected burst of energy, as if propelled by a new thought. "I just remembered something important, Dallery. What did you do for work before you got married?" "I'm a librarian," Dallery said. "Still am, actually. I work at the city library downtown." Ilara's face lit up with almost childlike excitement. "Alistair, did you hear that Dallery's a librarian?" Alistair looked puzzled, clearly still processing his mother's recent revelations. "Yes, Mother, I heard." "Don't you see it's perfect?" Ilara turned to Dallery, her eyes bright with a new elaborate scheme. "Alistair has been looking for someone to help organize his father's papers. Sterling was a historian, you know, and there are thousands of documents, photographs, letters. Alistair keeps saying he'll get to it when he has time, but I don't have time," Alistair finished with a sigh, recognizing the familiar preamble. "Mother, I'm sure Dallery has her own job to get back to. Actually, Dallery said, slowly, an idea beginning to form in her mind, a flicker of possibility. I'm on leave from the library until after New Year's. Personal time. It had been planned as vacation time, a romantic escape to the Dolomites with Percival. But that obviously wasn't happening now. Instead, she was adrift, without purpose or destination. And the thought of returning to her empty house, to her empty routine, filled her with a profound sense of dread. Elara clapped her hands together with glee. See? It's fate. Dallery needs somewhere to stay while she sorts out her divorce. Alistair needs help with Sterling's papers. And I need some female company that isn't Mrs. Pinter bringing casseroles. Alistair was shaking his head, a mixture of amusement and exasperation on his face. Mother. That's not appropriate. Dallery doesn't need to. How much would you pay someone to do that kind of work? Dallery interrupted her voice, surprising herself with its directness. The question hung in the air, pragmatic and sharp. He named a figure that made Dallery's eyebrows rise. It was more than she made in 2 months at the library. And it would take how long? Probably 2 weeks, if someone knew what they were doing and was willing to work diligently. Dallery did quick math in her head. 2 weeks of good pay, somewhere comfortable to stay, while she figured out her next steps and a project that would keep her mind occupied instead of dwelling on Percival's gut-wrenching betrayal. It was a lifeline, a temporary port in the storm, and a practical solution to her suddenly precarious situation. It offered structure, purpose, and a sense of agency at a time when her life felt completely out of control. I'm interested, Dallery said. Alistair stared at her, genuinely surprised. You're serious? Completely serious. I need somewhere to stay. I need the money. And I'm good at organizing documents. It sounds like we could help each other. Elara was practically bouncing in her chair. Wonderful. It's settled. Dallery will stay here and work on Sterling's papers, and I'll have someone interesting to talk to, Mother Alistair said carefully, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Don't you think we should discuss this privately first? What's to discuss? Elara asked, waving a dismissive hand. Dallery helped me tonight when she could have just minded her own business. She's educated, she's kind, and she makes me laugh. Plus, she's not Mrs. Pinter. Dallery found herself laughing again, a light, genuine sound that felt good after the hollow bitterness of earlier. That's definitely true. I'm not Mrs. Pinter. Alistair was looking back and forth between them, like he'd completely lost control of the conversation which he had. But Dallery could see him thinking, weighing the practical benefits against whatever lingering reservations he had about having a stranger, however helpful, in his house. The meticulous calculation of a businessman. 2 weeks, he said, finally, a note of resignation in his voice. Trial basis. If it's not working out for any of us, no hard feelings. Agreed, Dallery said, extending her hand. He shook it, and his grip was warm and firm. I think this might be the most impulsive decision I've ever made. Alistair confessed, a small, self-deprecating smile on his face. Good, Elara said decisively. You need more impulsive decisions in your life, Alistair. Don't you think so, Dallery? Dallery looked at Alistair Hawthorne, successful, careful, obviously carrying his own share of old hurts. And then at Elara, who was beaming like she'd just orchestrated the best Christmas miracle ever. I think Dallery said carefully that sometimes impulsive decisions lead to exactly where you need to be. What she didn't say was that sitting in this beautiful, opulent room, planning to spend 2 weeks organizing a dead man's papers, felt like the first step toward a life she couldn't even imagine yet. And for the first time since walking into her living room and finding her husband with another woman, she felt like maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. It was a step, however tentative, away from the familiar, toward the unknown, toward a nascent hope. The blue guest room was larger than Dallery's entire downstairs at home, with tall, elegant windows that overlooked what appeared to be extensive, snow-dusted gardens, now a monochromatic landscape under the dim night sky. Mrs. Morrison had thoughtfully left out a selection of Ilara's nightgowns and a silk robe, each one of silk or fine cotton, probably worth more than Dallery's entire sleepwear collection. She chose a simple, flowing blue silk one that felt like wearing a cloud, surprisingly comforting against her skin after the rough edges of the day. As Dallery got ready for bed, her phone buzzed softly on the bedside table. A text message. It was from Percival. Dallery, we need to talk. I know you're angry, but walking out isn't going to solve anything. I'm at the Rosewood Inn on Route 9. Call me when you're ready to discuss this like adults. Dallery stared at the message for a long moment, the words swimming before her eyes. Discuss this like adults. He'd written. As if she was the one who'd been behaving childishly by objecting to finding him tongue-deep with his secretary under their Christmas tree. The sheer gall of it, the narcissistic self-pity twisted in her gut. She deleted the message without responding, a small, defiant act of autonomy. There was a soft knock at her door. Come in. Dallery called, expecting Mrs. Morrison with extra towels or some last-minute amenity. Instead, Ilara appeared in the doorway, looking surprisingly alert for someone who'd been confused just hours earlier. She wore a beautiful cream-coloured silk robe, exquisitely embroidered, and carried 2 mugs of what smelled like rich, warm, hot chocolate. I thought you might like something warm before bed, Ilara said, offering Dallery one of the mugs with a gentle smile. Mrs. Morrison makes the most wonderful hot chocolate. Her secret ingredient is a splash of fine bourbon. That sounds perfect, Dallery said. Accepting the mug gratefully, the warmth seeping into her chilled hands, Ilara settled into the deep reading chair by the window, pulling the robe more tightly around herself. Dallery? She began, her voice softer now, more vulnerable. I hope you don't think I was being pushy earlier about Alistair about this job. I worry about him. You weren't pushy, Dallery assured her, a genuine smile forming. Well, maybe a little pushy, but in a nice way. Ilara chuckled softly. Sterling always said I had the subtlety of a freight train when I thought I was helping people. But Alistair, he's been so alone since Clarissa left, and since his father died. He's been taking care of everyone else but himself. It's not good for a man to be so solitary. What was Sterling like, Dallery asked, curious to know more about the man whose legacy now filled an entire study. Ilara's face softened, a wistful look in her eyes. Brilliant, funny, stubborn as a mule when he thought he was right, which was most of the time. He was a professor at the University American History. He specialized in Civil War-era documents and letters. The papers Alistair wants you to organize are Sterling's life's work, you know. His grand obsession. That sounds like a fascinating project. The prospect of diving into such a rich, tangible past felt strangely grounding, a stark contrast to the emotional turbulence of her present. It is. Sterling spent 40 years collecting documents, letters, photographs from families whose ancestors fought in the war. He was planning to write a book about the ordinary people who lived through extraordinary times, the forgotten voices. He believed their stories were just as important as the generals and politicians. Ilara's voice grew sad, a shadow passing over her features. He never got to finish it. How did he die? Heart attack. Sudden. One day he was working in his study, excited about some new letters that he'd acquired from an estate sale. And the next morning... She shrugged, a small, helpless gesture. But Dallery could see the pain still sharp in her eyes, as raw as if it had happened yesterday. I'm sorry. That must have been devastating. It was. But you know what the worst part is? Ilara's voice dropped barely a whisper. I'm forgetting him. Little pieces at a time. Some days I can't remember what his voice sounded like, or the way he laughed at his own jokes. She looked out the window into the impenetrable darkness, a profound loneliness in her gaze. Alistair thinks I don't notice the confusion getting worse, but I do, most of the time. Most of vicinity of. Dallery didn't know what to say to that. How do you comfort someone who's losing their own memories, their own history, the very essence of who they are? That's why I want Alistair to find someone. Ilara continued, her voice gaining strength, a fierce determination replacing the sadness. Someone who can love him the way Sterling loved me. Someone who can create new memories with him before I forget all the old ones. She turned to Dallery, her blue eyes piercing. Mrs. Hawthorne, Ilara, I know what you're thinking. I just met you. I don't really know anything about you. And here I am hoping you might be interested in my son. She laughed, a gentle, self-deprecating sound. I told you I have the subtlety of a freight train. It's not that Dallery said, though it kind of was that. It's just, I found out about my husband's affair 3 hours ago. I'm not exactly in the market for romance right now. Of course not, Ilara agreed, her expression understanding. But Dallery, you strike me as the kind of woman who picks herself up and moves forward. And Alistair is worth moving forward toward when you're ready. What makes you so sure? Dallery asked, intrigued by Ilara's unwavering conviction. Ilara was quiet for a moment, sipping her hot chocolate, the rich scent of bourbon wafting subtly in the air. Because when you told us about finding your husband with that woman tonight, Alistair got angry, really angry. I could see it even if he was trying to hide it. And Alistair doesn't get angry on behalf of people he doesn't care about. That was an interesting observation. Alistair had been very controlled during their conversation, his emotions carefully leashed. But thinking back, there had been moments when his professional composure had slipped a flicker of raw emotion in his eyes. Ilara Dallery said carefully, "What happened with Alistair and Clarissa?" Really? Ilara's expression darkened, the warmth momentarily replaced by a cold, hard edge. Clarissa was beautiful, sophisticated, came from the right family. Everything Alistair thought he wanted in a wife. They were planning a wedding for the following spring. What went wrong? Dallery asked, bracing herself for another tale of betrayal. Alistair caught her with his business partner, in Alistair's own office, after hours. She said it wasn't serious, just a mistake. Begged him to forgive her. Ilara's voice turned bitter, a surprising venom in its tone. Alistair tried to work through it because he thought that was what mature adults did. Went to counselling, talked about rebuilding trust, all of that. But it wasn't just once. And it wasn't just his business partner. Clarissa liked excitement, liked having options. She was bored by Alistair's stability, by his loyalty. She wanted someone who would keep her guessing. Ilara met Dallery's eyes directly. Does that sound familiar? It did sound familiar. Percival's sudden fascination with Serafina, his complaints about their boring routine, his glib comments about how they'd grown apart. Maybe he'd been looking for excitement too. Perhaps some men at a certain age felt an irresistible pull towards the thrill of the chase, the validation of a younger, less complicated affection, even if it meant destroying everything they had. How did Alistair find out about the others? Dallery asked, a cold dread creeping into her voice. Private investigator. Alistair hired one when he started noticing things. Unexplained absences, mysterious phone calls, credit card charges she couldn't account for. Turned out Clarissa had been having affairs for most of their 3-year relationship. That's awful. Dallery felt a wave of empathy for Alistair. The quiet, contained anger making perfect sense now. It was. But you know what the worst part was? Clarissa tried to blame Alistair. Said he was too controlling, too focused on work, that she needed someone more spontaneous. Ilara's voice turned fierce, as if she were still defending her son years later. As if Alistair's character flaws justified her lying and cheating for 3 years. Dallery thought about Percival's comment that they'd grown apart, as if their marriage problems were something that had happened to them instead of choices he'd made. The parallels were chilling. What did Alistair do? Dallery asked, needing to know. Threw her out, changed the locks, cancelled the wedding, divided their business assets, and bought her out of her share of the company. Ilara smiled grimly. Sterling was so proud of how Alistair handled it. No drama, no begging, just clean, decisive action. And he hasn't been serious about anyone since. A few dates here and there, but nothing substantial. I think he's afraid to trust again. And since Sterling died and my condition got worse, he's been so focused on taking care of me that he doesn't have time for a personal life. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping their spiked hot chocolate. The bourbon, a welcome warmth spreading through Dallery's veins and looking out at the snow-covered gardens. Finally, Ilara spoke again, her voice softer, more reflective. Dallery, can I ask you something personal? After everything we've shared tonight, ask away. When you found your husband with that woman, were you surprised? Really surprised? Or had you been ignoring signs for a while? Dallery thought about that. Both. I think I was shocked in the moment, truly blindsided. But looking back, there were things. He'd been working late more often, paying more attention to his appearance. He seemed distracted when we talked, his gaze distant. I told myself it was just work stress, the demands of the firm, the complexities of his clients. She paused, taking another sip of the rich hot chocolate. I wanted to believe that. We see what we want to see, Ilara said gently. Her eyes clouded with her own memories. I did the same thing when Sterling was getting sick. He'd forget little thing, repeat stories, seemed confused about dates. I told myself he was just tired working too hard. It took months for me to admit something was really wrong. Do you regret waiting? Every day. We could have had more time to prepare, to make better decisions about his care. More time to say the important things. More time to just be together, truly present. Ilara looked at Dallery seriously, her gaze unwavering. Don't waste time pretending things are fine when they're not, Dallery. Life's too short and too unpredictable for such delusions. There was another soft knock at the door. This time it was Alistair, looking slightly embarrassed, but with a hint of concern in his eyes. I'm sorry to interrupt, he said, his voice quiet. Mother, you should be getting to bed. And, Dallery, I wanted to apologize for earlier, for Mother's rather direct matchmaking attempts. No apology necessary, Dallery said, a faint smile on her lips. She's worried about you. She worries about everyone, Alistair said with affection, the corner of his mouth twitching. It's one of her most endearing and exasperating qualities. Ilara stood up suddenly, looking every one of her 78 years, the earlier energy having dissipated. Alistair, will you help me to my room? I'm feeling a bit tired. Of course, Mother. As they reached the door, Ilara turned back to Dallery, her eyes soft with gratitude. Dallery, thank you again for tonight, for helping an old woman who was lost in more ways than one. Thank you for taking me in. Dallery, replied her voice husky with genuine emotion, for giving me somewhere to land while I figure out what comes next. After they left, Dallery sat in the reading chair finishing her hot chocolate and thinking about the strange, convoluted turns this day had taken. This morning she'd been a married woman looking forward to Christmas with her husband. Tonight she was staying in a mansion, planning to spend 2 weeks organising the papers of a dead historian and trying not to think about the way Alistair Hawthorne's intense blue eyes had softened when he talked about his mother. Her phone buzzed again. Another text from Percival. Dallery, please call me. We've been married 28 years. We owe it to each other to talk this through. I made a mistake, but I love you. Delary stared at the message for a long time. 28 years. That was worth something, wasn't it? People made mistakes. People could change. But then she thought about Clarissa, who had blamed Alistair for her own betrayals. She thought about Ilara's direct, unvarnished advice. Don't waste time pretending things are fine when they're not. And she thought about the way Percival had looked when she'd found him with Serafina. Not truly guilty, not deeply ashamed, but annoyed at being interrupted, inconvenienced. The casual cruelty of it, the assumption that she would simply tolerate it. She deleted the message and turned off her phone. Tomorrow, she would start organising Sterling Hawthorne's papers. Tomorrow, she would begin the arduous, bewildering process of figuring out what her life looked like without Percival in it. Tomorrow, she would start learning what it meant to stop pretending everything was fine. But tonight, she was going to sleep in silk pajamas that cost more than her monthly grocery budget, in a room larger than her entire downstairs, in a house where people said exactly what they meant and took in strangers who needed help. Tonight, for the first time in months, she felt like she might actually be exactly where she needed to be. That's when Dallery realized that sometimes the worst day of your life can also be the beginning of the best thing that ever happened to you. The next morning, Mrs. Morrison woke Dallery with a soft knock, a steaming cup of freshly brewed coffee, and what she called a proper breakfast. Eggs, crispy bacon, fresh fruit, and an array of delicate pastries that looked like they belonged in a glossy magazine spread. After 28 years of grabbing granola bars on her way out the door, being served breakfast in bed felt utterly surreal. A luxury she hadn't realized she was missing. "Mr. Alistair is waiting for you in his father's study when you're ready." "Mrs. Thompson," Mrs. Morrison said, setting the tray on the small antique table by the window. "No rush, though. He said to tell you that Sterling's papers have been waiting 3 years. They can wait another hour." There was a subtle amusement in Mrs. Morrison's tone that Dallery appreciated. After breakfast and a shower with water pressure that could strip paint, Dallery found herself standing outside a heavy, intricately carved oak door at the end of a long hallway lined with imposing family portraits. She knocked softly and heard Alistair's deep voice telling her to come in. Sterling Hawthorne's study was exactly what you'd expect from a dedicated historian. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined every wall, groaning under the weight of countless volumes. A massive mahogany desk dominated the center of the room, but its surface was almost entirely obscured by papers. Mountains of papers. Archival boxes, some tied with string, some simply overflowing, lined every available surface. Filing cabinets stood like silent sentinels along the walls, and loose documents were scattered across every horizontal surface. Chairs, tables, even parts of the floor, like a paper blizzard, had blown through the room and simply settled. The air, though, was surprisingly clean, free of dust, and carried the faint, comforting scent of aged paper and leather. Alistair was standing in the middle of it all, looking like a man who'd been handed a puzzle with 10,000 pieces and no picture on the box. He wore a crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled up to the elbows, revealing strong forearms and dark trousers. He looked formidable, even amidst the chaos. "Good morning," he said. A faint flush on his cheeks, making him look almost embarrassed. "I should have warned you. It's worse than I remembered." "It's not that bad." Dallery lied, surveying the breathtaking chaos with a professional eye. "I've seen worse." This was also a lie, but he didn't need to know that. A librarian's trick of the trade: always project calm and competence, even when faced with overwhelming disorder. "You're being kind. It looks like a research library exploded." He gestured helplessly at the nearest stack of papers, which teetered precariously. "I've been putting this off because every time I come in here, I just get overwhelmed and leave." "What exactly did your father collect?" Dallery asked, her professional curiosity kicking in, already mentally categorizing the visible piles. Everything. Alistair picked up a small, leather-bound journal and opened it carefully. His touch, reverent. Civil War letters, diary entries, photographs, military records, family documents. He bought entire estate collections when families were cleaning out attics. Some of this stuff dates back to 1860, perhaps even earlier. Dallery moved closer to look at the journal in his hands. The pages were filled with careful, looping handwriting, faded but still legible. The writer was describing a battle, the words so vivid, Dallery could almost smell the gunpowder and hear the distant shouts. It wasn't just historical text, it was a window into a raw human experience. "This is incredible," Dallery breathed, forgetting her professional composure for a moment, her librarian's heart quickening with excitement. "These are primary source documents. Do you realize how valuable this collection is, historically speaking?" "That's what my father always said." Alistair's voice was softer now, tinged with a quiet pride. He thought he could organize it all into a book about ordinary people, living through the Civil War stories, from soldiers' wives, children, farmers, shopkeepers. People whose voices usually get lost in the grand narratives of history books. That's a wonderful concept. What stopped him? Alistair's expression grew sad, a familiar shadow in his eyes. Time. He kept collecting faster than he could organize. Every estate sale, every antique dealer, every family cleaning out old attics. If there were Civil War-era documents, Dad had to have them. Dallery could see Sterling's passion, his unwavering dedication in the careful way the documents were stored. The acid-free boxes, the climate-controlled environment, even the labels on some of the more neatly packaged bundles. This wasn't hoarding. This was love. A scholar's profound respect for the past. "Where would you like me to start?" Dallery asked, feeling a surge of energy. For the first time in days, her mind felt engaged, truly alive. "Honestly, anywhere. I was thinking maybe chronological organization first, then by document type." "I don't know. You're the expert." He gave her a helpless, almost boyish shrug. Dallery wasn't exactly an expert in historical document organization specific to the Civil War. But she'd organized enough library collections, enough sprawling family archives to have a system. "Let's start with a basic inventory." She proposed, her voice firm and confident, taking charge. "We need to know what we're dealing with before we can organize it properly." They worked in comfortable silence for the first hour. Alistair reading dates and locations from various documents. His voice a low, steady rumble, while Dallery made detailed lists in a new notebook Mrs. Morrison had provided. It quickly became clear that Sterling Hawthorne had been even more thorough, even more dedicated than his son realized. There were letters from dozens of different families spanning multiple states, their stories interwoven. Photographs, many with detailed, often poignant notes about who was in them, their names, their relationships, their fates. And official military documents that belonged in museums, meticulously preserved alongside the personal narratives. Alistair, Dallery said, holding up a small packet of letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon. The paper was fragile, yellowed with age, but handled with meticulous care. "These are from a woman named Sarah to her husband during Sherman's march to the sea." "Do you know what these would be worth to a Civil War museum? Not just monetarily, but historically." "Dad never wanted to sell anything," Alistair said, a touch of reverence in his voice. "He said these were people's lives, not commodities." "I'm not suggesting selling them," Dallery clarified, shaking her head. "I'm suggesting your father's collection could become a significant historical archive, a lasting legacy. Universities would be intensely interested in this. Museums would want to create exhibits around these narratives, to bring these forgotten voices to life for future generations." Alistair stopped sorting and looked at Dalari. Truly looked at her. His expression shifting. You really think it's that important? Alistair. I think your father spent 40 years preserving voices that would otherwise be lost forever, silenced by time. That's not just important, it's invaluable. It's a profound act of historical preservation, a gift to the future. Dalari felt her passion for history, for stories, for the quiet heroism of ordinary lives bubbling to the surface. It was a refreshing contrast to the shallow, self-serving betrayals of her recent past. Something shifted in Alistair's expression as Dalari spoke. The careful politeness he'd maintained since last night, a subtle barrier softened into something that looked like genuine interest, even admiration. The executive persona seemed to recede, revealing a man who was deeply connected to his family's legacy, to his father's passion. Tell me more, he said. Leaning against the edge of Sterling's massive desk, his gaze fixed on her. So Dalari did. She told him about the historical significance of personal documents, about how letters and diaries give us unparalleled insights into how ordinary people experienced major historical events. The daily struggles, the small joys, the immense sorrows. She explained how his father's work, if properly catalogued and shared, could become a lasting legacy, helping future generations understand the human cost of war, the resilience of the human spirit. She spoke of the power of individual stories to illuminate universal truths. You really love this, don't you? Alistair asked when Dalari paused for breath, a genuine curiosity in his tone. I love history, yes, but more than that, I love stories. Dalari admitted a genuine unbidden smile gracing her lips. Every one of these documents tells a story about real people who loved and lost and hoped and grieved. Your father understood that deeply. He honored their lives by preserving their words. He would have liked you, Alistair said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. Dad always said the best historians were the ones who remembered that history is about people, not just dates and battles. There was something in his voice that made Dalari look at him more closely. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, like he was trying to solve a puzzle she didn't know she'd presented. Alistair, is everything all right? Yes, it's just... He paused, seeming to struggle with something, a frown furrowing his brow. There's something familiar about you, something I can't quite place. Have we met before? Before last night, I mean. Dalari's heart did a funny little skip. There was something familiar about him too, though she couldn't pinpoint what. Something about his smile, the way he moved his hands when he talked, the particular way he tilted his head when he was deep in thought. It was a sensation of déjà vu, a resonance that had been subtly present since she first saw him in the diner. I don't think so, Dalari said. Slowly, carefully. I'm pretty sure I'd remember meeting you. You're probably right. It's just one of those déjà vu feelings, I suppose. He offered a self-deprecating smile, dismissing the thought. They went back to work, but the conversation had changed something between them. The polite professional distance from this morning had given way to easier conversation. Shared laughter when they found particularly dramatic or amusing letters, and a growing awareness that they worked remarkably well together. It was a different kind of connection, a meeting of minds over shared passion that resonated deeply within Dalari. It felt effortless, natural, a balm after the forced pleasantries and hidden resentments of her marriage. Elara appeared at lunchtime, bearing a tray of gourmet sandwiches prepared by Mrs. Morrison, and what she cheerfully announced was proper supervision. How's the work going? She asked, settling into Sterling's large, leather-bound reading chair as if she belonged there, which of course she did. Your father was incredibly thorough, Dalari told her, a smile playing on her lips. But he had no organizational system whatsoever. That sounds like Sterling, Elara said fondly, a genuine warmth in her voice. He could remember the provenance of every document, but couldn't remember where he put his reading glasses half the time. Speaking of remembering things, Alistair said, carefully glancing at his mother with a subtle cue. Mother, does Dallery remind you of anyone? Someone from a long time ago. Elara studied Dallery with the sharp, unpredictable attention that seemed to come and go in flashes. Now that you mention it, yes. She reminds me of that girl you used to date in university. What was her name? The one with the beautiful smile and the quick wit. Elara frowned, her brow furrowing in concentration, the thought slipping away like smoke. Mother, I dated several girls in university. No, the special one. The one you brought home for Thanksgiving your senior year. The one you were planning to… Ilara's frown deepened, the elusive memory just out of reach. Oh, what was her name? Mother. I think you're confusing different people. Alistair interjected, a slight tension in his voice. But Ilara was now studying Dallery's face with increasing intensity, a look of dawning recognition spreading across her features. Dallery, what did you say your maiden name was? She asked, her voice sudden and sharp. I didn't mention it, Dallery said, feeling oddly nervous, a prickle of unease running down her spine. It was Collins. Dallery Collins. Ilara's face went completely still, her eyes wide with sudden, absolute shock. Then she turned to Alistair, her hand going to her mouth. Alistair, she said slowly, her voice barely a whisper. Look at her. Really look at her. Alistair stared at Dallery, and she watched his expression change slowly, agonizingly, as something clicked into place. His face went pale, then flushed, then pale again, a profound shock washing over him. Dallery Collins, he said, and his voice was barely audible, a ghost of a sound. You two know each other? Ilara said, with immense satisfaction, her earlier confusion vanishing in a wave of triumphant recognition. I knew it. The moment you walked into that diner together, I knew there was something. We don't know each other, Dallery said quickly, though her heart was pounding for reasons she couldn't explain, a strange sense of inevitability settling over her. We just met last night. But Alistair was shaking his head slowly, his gaze still fixed on Dallery, a mixture of disbelief and dawning realization in his eyes. No, he said, his voice stronger now, more certain. We didn't just meet. We've met before. A long time ago. When Dallery asked, her voice barely above a whisper, though part of her was beginning to suspect, she didn't want to know. The answer didn't want the past to collide with her already chaotic present. Thanksgiving dinner, 1994. Alistair said quietly, the memory crystal clear in his eyes. You were a senior at State, art history major. You wore a blue dress that matched your eyes, and you made my mother laugh so hard at dinner that she snorted wine through her nose. The room seemed to tilt sideways, the solid reality of Sterling's step blurring around her. She remembered the grand, intimidating house that had been Paris, the handsome, charming boy who brought her home to meet his family, the quiet thrill of being a part of something so fun, so sophisticated. She remembered falling completely head over heels for a boy named Alistair. But his last name hadn't been Hawthorne. It had been Alistair Harrison, Dallery whispered. Her voice choked with shock and disbelief. I went by my middle name in university, he said. His voice now laced with a painful, dawning understanding. Alistair Harrison Hawthorne? I thought it sounded less pretentious than the full name. Ilara was looking back and forth between them like she was watching the world's most interesting and long-delayed tennis match. Well, she said, finally a mischievous twinkle in her eye. This is going to be interesting. That's when Dallery realized that the strange familiarity, the subtle sense of déjà vu, the nagging feeling that she'd been here before, that she knew this man, It was because she had been here before. 29 years ago, she'd sat at Alistair Hawthorne's family dinner table and fallen in love with him. And then she'd waited for him to call her back after winter break. Waited, and he never did. He had simply vanished, leaving a gaping wound in her young heart, a wound she had quietly carried, then meticulously, painstakingly covered with the comforting routine of her life with Percival. The quiet betrayal of her husband, now suddenly intertwined with the long-buried, unexplained abandonment of her first love. Her past had just crashed violently into her present. The silence in Sterling's study stretched until it felt like a living, suffocating thing filled with the ghosts of 29 years of unresolved history. Dallery stared at Alistair Harrison, the boy who'd broken her 21-year-old heart, and tried to process what was happening. Her mind reeling. The carefully constructed walls around her past, around her grief, around her carefully rationalized abandonment had just crumbled. Ilara ever. The orchestrator was watching them both with the kind of expression usually reserved for particularly fascinating museum exhibits, a mixture of keen interest and suppressed amusement. I think Ilara said, finally breaking the heavy silence, I should leave you two alone to sort this out. She stood up with more energy than Dallery had seen from her since last night, a spring in her step. But before I go, Alistair, you absolute fool. You never told me you let this one get away. Mother Alistair protested, a flush rising on his cheeks. But Ilara was already heading for the door, her words hanging in the air like a pronouncement. Don't mother me. Dallery dear, make him explain himself properly. And Alistair, don't screw this up again. The heavy oak door closed behind her with a decisive click, leaving them alone with 29 years of questions, hurt and unspoken words floating palpably between them. Dallery Alistair said quietly, his voice a low, hesitant rumble in the suddenly cavernous room. I can explain. Can you? Dallery asked, and she was proud that her voice sounded steadier than she felt a sharp edge in its tone. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've had plenty of time to explain. Like, say, 29 years. He flinched, the accusation hitting its mark. You're angry. I'm confused. There's a difference. Though anger might be coming. Dallery sank down heavily into the nearest armchair, mainly because her legs suddenly felt unreliable, the shock threatening to buckle her. You're Alistair Harrison. The Alistair Harrison who took me to his parents' house for Thanksgiving dinner. Who told me he loved me. Who said he'd call me after winter break. Yes. His voice was barely audible. The Alistair Harrison who disappeared without a word. No phone call, no letter, no explanation. Just gone. Yes. His gaze dropped to his hands, clasped tightly in front of him. And now, 29 years later, you show up as Alistair Hawthorne, mysterious, wealthy businessman whose mother I happen to find wandering outside a church. It's a bit dramatic, wouldn't you say? It's not what you think. I think you owe me an explanation. A really good one. Dallery's tone was firm, demanding a stark contrast to the heartbroken girl who had once waited by a silent telephone. Alistair sat down heavily in his father's massive desk chair, running his hands through his silvering hair in a gesture that was achingly, unsettlingly familiar. After Thanksgiving break, my father called me into his study. He'd been watching you, watching us together, and he'd done some research. Dallery's heart began to pound with a cold, sickening premonition. Research. What kind of research? Into your family background. Your father was a mechanic. Your mother worked part-time at a grocery store. You were paying for university with student loans and scholarships. Alistair's voice was flat, devoid of emotion, as if reciting a painful litany. My father informed me that you were obviously a gold digger. Dallery felt her mouth fall open in disbelief. A gasp catching in her throat. A gold digger. The accusation was so absurd, so far from her reality, it was laughable. but the sting of it, even after all these years, was sharp. He said girls like you targeted boys from wealthy families, that you'd probably researched our family before accepting my invitation home, that you were using me to get access to money, to status. And you believed him. The words came out sharper than Dallery had intended, laced with a bitterness that 29 years had not quite erased. I was 22 years old, Dallery, and I'd never gone against my father's wishes in my life. Alistair said miserably, the confident businessman replaced by the haunted young man. He threatened to cut off my trust fund if I continued seeing you, said I could choose between the family fortune and a fortune hunter. Dallery stared at him, trying to reconcile this story with the confident, successful man sitting across from her. So you chose the money. I chose what I thought was my future. My father had my entire life planned out: law school, joining the family business, marrying someone from an appropriate family. Fighting him meant giving up everything I thought I wanted. Everything I'd been raised to believe was my destiny. And calling me to explain was… what? Too much trouble. Dallery's voice was laced with an acid sarcasm she couldn't quite control. The raw pain of that abandonment, once dulled, now flared. Alistair's face flushed scarlet. I was a coward, Dallery, a complete and utter coward. I knew if I heard your voice, if I had to explain why I was choosing money over you, I'd lose my nerve. So I just didn't call. For 29 years. For 29 years. Dallery leaned back in her chair, a dizzying mix of emotions swirling through her. 21-year-old Dallery had been utterly devastated when Alistair vanished. She'd spent months wondering what she'd done wrong, replaying every conversation for signs she'd missed, for clues to her own perceived inadequacy. She'd eventually painfully convinced herself that what they'd shared hadn't been as special as she'd thought, that his feelings had been fleeting, a youthful infatuation easily forgotten. She had learned to bury the memory to protect herself from the recurring sting of rejection, and had chosen a practical, stable life, with Percival mistaking comfort for profound connection. You know what the really funny part is? Dallery said. Finally, a mirthless laugh escaping her lips. What? I never knew your family had money. You drove a beat-up Honda. You wore jeans with holes in them. You took me to cheap restaurants, argued with me over the last slice of pizza. I thought you were just another broke university student, bright and charming, but struggling like the rest of us. Alistair's head snapped up, his blue eyes wide with a new kind of shock, a profound realization. You didn't know. How would I know? You never mentioned it. You never acted like someone from a wealthy family. The fancy house was my first clue, and by then I was too nervous about meeting your parents to think about what it meant. You really didn't know, Alistair said slowly, and something in his expression was shifting, hardening not with anger, but with a deep, crushing regret. I fell in love with Alistair Harrison, broke university student who made me laugh and argued with me about books and kissed me like the world was ending. Your father's money never entered into it. Oh, God. Alistair buried his face in his hands, a raw groan escaping him. Oh, God, what did I do? You chose money over love. People do it all the time. Dallery's voice was colder than she intended, a protective shield against the resurfacing vulnerability. No, you don't understand. I didn't just choose money. I threw away the best thing that ever happened to me because my father convinced me it wasn't real. He looked up at her and his eyes were bright with unshed tears, the professional composure completely shattered. Dallery, what we had that was real, wasn't it? I didn't imagine it. It was real, Dallery said softly, the admission. A quiet ache in her chest. At least it was real for me. For me too. I've spent 29 years trying to find something that felt like what we had. I never did. Is that why you never married? Dallery asked, unable to stop herself. Because you were pining for your lost university love. She meant it to sound sarcastic, sharp, but it came out gentler than she'd intended, imbued with a strange, dawning empathy. Partly, but mostly because after Clarissa, I realized my father had been wrong about you, but right about one thing. I was terrible at judging people's real motives. I kept attracting women who saw dollar signs instead of me who saw the family name and not the man. So you just stopped trying. I stopped trusting. There's a difference. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of 29 years of misunderstanding settling heavily between them. Dalari thought about the young woman she'd been so full of hope, so utterly devastated by his unexplained disappearance. How long it had taken her to trust another man enough to marry him, to build a life, however flawed. The layers of betrayal, past and present, had seemed to coalesce into a single, overwhelming burden. Alistair Dallery said, finally, her voice low and steady. I need you to understand something. What happened between us in university? That was a lifetime ago. I'm not the same person I was at 21. Neither am I. He conceded, his gaze fixed on her. I was married for 28 years. I loved my husband. Not the way I loved you. That was different. Deeper, maybe. A first love is always unique. But I loved him. Until yesterday I thought I was happy. And now I don't know what I think. My entire life has been turned upside down in the last 24 hours. Finding out about Percival's affair, meeting your mother, coming here, and now this. She gestured vaguely between them, indicating the weight of their shared, rediscovered history. I can't process all of this at once. I understand. Do you, Dallery challenged softly, meeting his intense gaze. Because I feel like you're looking at me and seeing that 21-year-old girl you used to know, but she's gone, Alistair. I'm 54 years old. I'm getting divorced, and I have no idea what I want my life to look like going forward. Alistair was quiet for a long moment, studying her face, truly seeing her, the lines of experience around her eyes, the strength in her jaw, the quiet resilience in her gaze. You're right, he said finally, his voice soft but firm. I am seeing that girl. Yes. But I'm also seeing the woman who helped my mother last night, who treated her with such kindness when she could have just called the authorities. I'm seeing someone who gets excited talking about historical documents and who can make my mother laugh. I'm seeing someone who's brave enough to walk away from a bad marriage and start over. His eyes met hers, clear and unwavering. And I'd like to get to know who you are now. Not who you were 29 years ago, but who you are today, if you'll let me. Dallery looked at this man who was simultaneously a stranger and achingly familiar. A ghost from her past, now made flesh. The boy she'd fallen in love with had been sweet, idealistic, full of dreams about changing the world. This man was more careful, more guarded, carrying his own share of disappointments and betrayals, yet still possessing a core of deep integrity. I can't promise anything, Dallery said, her voice a little shaky. I don't know what I want right now beyond getting through the next 2 weeks. I'm not asking for promises. I'm asking for a chance to show you that I'm not the same coward who disappeared 29 years ago. What about your mother? Dallery asked, a wry smile touching her lips. She's clearly hoping this is some kind of romantic reunion. Alistair chuckled, a rich, warm sound that resonated through the study. My mother has been hoping I'd find someone to love for the past 5 years. She'd probably be matchmaking even if we were complete strangers. And Mrs. Morrison and the people who work for you, Dallery, continued gesturing vaguely at the opulent surroundings. What are they going to think about your mother's librarian friend moving into the house and suddenly reacquainting herself with the master? They're going to think I'm finally doing something right for once, Alistair said, his eyes twinkling with genuine amusement. Dallery laughed, despite herself, a lightness she hadn't felt in days bubbling up. You're very sure of yourself. I'm not sure of anything. But Dallery finding you again, even under these tumultuous circumstances. It feels like a second chance, and I'm old enough now to know how rare those are. Before Dallery could respond, there was a soft knock at the study door. Ilara poked her head in, looking hopeful. A wide, innocent smile on her face. "Are you two finished sorting out your past?" she asked. "Because Mrs. Morrison wants to know if Dallery will be staying for dinner, and I need to know if I should ask her to set out the good china." Alistair and Dallery looked at each other. 29 years of questions of hurt, of missed opportunities, hung in the air between them. But underneath that, there was something else. The faint echo of what they'd once felt for each other, changed by time, seasoned by experience, but not completely gone. "Yes," Dallery said. Surprising herself, a decisive nod of her head. "I'll stay for dinner." But Ilara? "Yes, dear. Maybe just the regular china. I'm not sure I'm ready for the good stuff yet." Ilara beamed, her eyes sparkling like she'd just been given the perfect Christmas present, her scheme unfolding beautifully. "Regular china it is?" "But Dallery," she added, her voice conspiratorial. "The good china will be waiting when you're ready for it." As the door closed behind her, Dallery realized that Ilara wasn't just talking about dishes. She was talking about letting herself believe that maybe, just maybe, some endings were actually new beginnings in disguise. Dinner that night was surreal in the best possible way. They ate in what Ilara called the small dining room, which was only small compared to the formal dining room that could apparently seat 24 people. Mrs. Morrison had prepared something called beef bourguignon that tasted like it belonged in a 5-star restaurant, rich and savoury. And Ilara regaled them with stories about Alistair's childhood that made him blush like a teenager, his careful composure dissolving under his mother's fond teasing. "Did I tell you about the time Alistair decided he was going to be a professional baseball player?" Ilara asked, passing Dallery the wine that probably cost more than her monthly car payment. "Mother, please don't." Alistair groaned, burying his face in his hands. He was 12 years old and absolutely convinced that the Yankees were going to scout him. So Sterling built him a pitching mound in the backyard, and Alistair spent the entire summer throwing baseballs at a target painted on the garage door. "That's sweet," Dallery said, trying to picture the serious, controlled Alistair as an enthusiastic, wide-eyed 12-year-old. "Oh, it gets better." He convinced Sterling to time his pitches and keep statistics. Poor Sterling spent hours crouched behind a catcher's mitt, writing down numbers, while Alistair practiced his major league delivery. "What happened?" Dallery asked, though she suspected she knew. "High school baseball tryouts." Alistair threw exactly 3 pitches before the coach told him to try debate team instead. Ilara was grinning, clearly enjoying her son's discomfort. Sterling said watching Alistair's dreams of athletic glory die was like watching a flower wilt in fast motion. "I made varsity debate team," Alistair said defensively, lifting his head. "We went to state championships." "Yes, dear. Much more appropriate for someone with your particular talents." Dallery watched this playful exchange with fascination. This was a side of Alistair she'd never seen. The beloved only son, gently teased by parents who clearly adored him. It made her wonder what other parts of himself he'd hidden, or perhaps simply suppressed when they were young. "What about you?" Dallery Ilara asked, turning her attention to her. "What did you want to be when you grew up?" "An archaeologist," Dallery said without thinking. The dream long buried but still present. "I wanted to discover ancient civilizations and solve historical mysteries." "What changed your mind?" Dallery thought about 21-year-old Dallery, full of dreams about graduate school and exotic dig sites, and then the painful reality of Alistair's sudden disappearance. Reality, I suppose. Archaeology requires advanced degrees funding the ability to travel extensively. After Alistair and I... She caught herself, the old reflex of self-preservation kicking in. After university ended, I needed a practical career that would let me support myself immediately. So you became a librarian? Alistair said quietly, his gaze thoughtful. I became a librarian. It lets me work with books and research help people find information they need. It's not archaeology, but it's good work. Fulfilling in its own way. Do you regret it? Ilara asked, her voice soft. No, Dallery said, and realized she meant it. I like my work. I like helping people. And I've had a good life, even if it wasn't the life I planned at 21. But Ilara prompted because apparently she could hear the unspoken thoughts in Dallery's voice. But sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd been braver, if I'd pursued graduate school anyway. Taken more risks, not let practical concerns make all my decisions. Alistair was watching her with an expression Dallery couldn't quite read, a deep intensity in his eyes. It's not too late, he said. You're 54, not 94. If you wanted to go back to school, pursue archaeology now. At my age, don't be ridiculous. Dallery scoffed, the deeply ingrained pragmatism of years asserting itself. Why is that ridiculous? Alistair challenged, leaning forward. You have experience, education. Presumably some financial resources now that you're getting divorced. What's stopping you except the assumption that you're too old? Dallery opened her mouth to list all the practical reasons why it was impossible, then stopped. Why? Was it impossible? Because she'd accepted the idea that dreams had expiration dates. Because she'd spent so many years being practical, responsible, safe, that she'd forgotten how to be brave. She could audit some classes, Ilara said thoughtfully, already plotting. Get a feel for whether she really wants to pursue it seriously. The State University has an excellent archaeology program, Alistair added. I should know. I've donated enough money to their department over the years. They were both looking at her like this was a perfectly reasonable conversation, instead of a complete upheaval of everything Dallery had accepted about her life. This is crazy, Dallery said, shaking her head, a smile playing on her lips. 3 days ago, I was a married librarian planning Christmas dinner with my husband. Now you're suggesting I become a middle-aged graduate student. I'm suggesting you become whoever you want to become, Alistair said, his voice gentle but firm. Age is just a number. It's never too late to redefine yourself. Easy for you to say. You're successful, wealthy, established. I'm about to be divorced and unemployed. Temporarily unemployed, Ilara corrected, tapping her finger on the table. And only temporarily divorced if you're smart about it. Dallery stared at her. What's that supposed to mean? It means, Ilara said with a sly, knowing smile, that some divorces lead to better marriages. Mother Alistair warned, a flicker of exasperation in his eyes. What I'm just saying that sometimes you have to clear out the old to make room for the new. She turned to Dallery conspiratorially. Dallery? Dear, you do realize my son is quite the catch. Successful, handsome, excellent provider, and he makes wonderful beef stew. You make beef stew? Dallery asked Alistair, latching on to the least complicated part of that statement. It's one of my 3 dishes, he admitted, a self-deprecating grin on his face. Beef stew, grilled chicken, and scrambled eggs. He's not exactly what you'd call a chef, Ilara added helpfully. But he's very good at ordering takeout, and he owns stock in several excellent restaurants. Despite everything, Dallery found herself laughing, a genuine, joyful sound. Ilara, you're shameless. Completely shameless. She agreed cheerfully. At my age, subtlety is a waste of time. I like you, Dallery. You're good for Alistair. You make him laugh. You challenge him. And you're not afraid of him. Afraid of him? Dallery echoed, puzzled. Most women are intimidated by Alistair's money, his success, his serious demeanour. They either want to change him or they want to spend his fortune. You just want him to explain himself properly and help with historical documents. It's refreshing. Dallery glanced at Alistair, who was looking like he wished the floor would swallow him whole. Is that true? Are people usually afraid of you? People are usually interested in what I can do for them, he said carefully. His voice devoid of self-pity, just quiet observation. It gets hard to tell who likes me versus who likes my resources. That must be lonely. It is. There was something in his voice that made Delari's chest tighten, a quiet vulnerability that resonated with her own. She thought about Percival, who'd ultimately chosen excitement and novelty over 28 years of partnership. She thought about Clarissa, who'd betrayed Alistair's trust for years. It occurred to Dallery that both she and Alistair had learned to be careful to protect themselves, to expect disappointment, to build walls. Well, Dallery said, finally looking directly at Alistair, a newfound resolve in her eyes. You don't have to worry about that with me. I don't need your money. I'm not intimidated by your success, and I'm too experienced to be impressed by anyone's serious demeanour. Too old? Alistair raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement in his gaze. Too experienced. There's a difference. Ilara clapped her hands together delightedly. Perfect. It's settled then. Dallery will stay and help Alistair with Sterling's papers, and we'll see what develops naturally. Mother, you can't just declare people's romantic futures like you're planning a dinner party. Alistair's tone was one of weary, affectionate exasperation. Watch me, Ilara said with satisfaction, a twinkle in her eye.